Hello everyone, and welcome back to Trail of Secret. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. It was late one evening when I found myself at the grocery store, trying to grab a few things for dinner after a long day. The store was nearly empty, with only a handful of people quietly moving through the aisles. I had deliberately chosen this time because I knew it would be less crowded, giving me a chance to shop in peace. After gathering my items, I made my way to the checkout counter. I was tired but relieved to finally be heading home. The cashier, a young man who looked like he was in his early 20s, gave me a polite nod as he started scanning my groceries. His movements were quick and efficient, clearly the result of experience. The only sound in the otherwise silent store was the beeping of the scanner. I barely noticed when the cashier paused for a moment, glancing up at me with an unreadable expression. I assumed he was distracted or perhaps just as tired as I was. He continued scanning the rest of my items without a word, and I pulled out my wallet to pay. It was an ordinary, uneventful transaction until he handed me my receipt. His hand lingered just a second longer than necessary as he passed it to me, and then he leaned forward slightly. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. "Be careful," he said. The words sent a chill down my spine. I froze for a moment, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What?" I asked, startled. He didn't respond immediately. He met my eyes for a brief second before looking away, resuming his task as if nothing had happened. I glanced around the store, but no one else seemed to have noticed the exchange. The other cashiers were busy with their customers, and the few shoppers in the aisles paid no attention to us. "What do you mean?" I pressed, my voice quieter this time, almost hesitant. He shook his head slightly, avoiding my gaze, and began scanning the next customer's items. It was as if the moment had passed, and he didn't want to elaborate. Feeling a surge of unease, I picked up my bags and moved toward the exit. His words echoed in my mind as I walked to my car. The parking lot was dimly lit, and a light drizzle had begun to fall. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, my heart racing. What did he mean by "be careful"? Was he warning me about something specific? Did he know something I didn't? Or was it just a harmless comment? The possibilities swirled in my head as I unlocked my car and got inside, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the receipt in my hand. Half expecting to find a note or clue scribbled on it, I turned it over, but it was just an ordinary receipt. A list of items purchased, the total at the bottom. Nothing unusual. Feeling foolish for letting it bother me so much, I started the car and drove home. But the unease lingered. Every car that passed me seemed to stay in my peripheral vision a moment too long. Every shadow along the sidewalk seemed to shift as I drove by. When I finally pulled into my driveway, a wave of relief washed over me. Home was my safe place, and I was eager to put the strange encounter behind me. I carried my groceries inside, locking the door and double-checking the windows. As I unpacked the bags, I couldn't help but glance out the window every few minutes, still replaying the cashier's warning in my mind. I told myself I was overreacting, that his words were probably nothing more than an odd choice of phrase, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I debated whether I should go back to the store and ask the cashier what he meant, but the idea felt absurd. What would I even say? That his words had unsettled me to the point of obsession? I knew I'd sound ridiculous, and there was no guarantee he would even be working that day. Instead, I decided to let it go. I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about, but as the day went on, small things began to unnerve me. I noticed a car parked across the street from my house. It was an old beat-up sedan that I hadn't seen before. At first, I dismissed it, assuming it belonged to a visitor or was just a coincidence. But as the hours passed, the car remained, and I started to feel uneasy. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I heard a faint noise outside, like footsteps on gravel. It sent a shiver down my spine. I went to the window and peered out, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The car was still there, its silhouette barely visible under the dim streetlights. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that the cashier's words had planted a seed of paranoia in my mind, but the unease was impossible to ignore. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, and I found myself straining to hear any signs of something unusual. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with unsettling images, shadowy figures lurking just out of sight, whispers I couldn't quite make out, and always the cashier's voice repeating those two words, "Be careful." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. For a moment I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming. As the days went on, the feeling of unease began to fade, though it never completely disappeared. I stopped noticing the car parked across the street, and the strange noises outside became easier to ignore. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an unsettling experience. Every now and then, I think back to that moment in the store, to the cashier's whispered warning. I still wonder what he meant, if anything at all. Was it a random comment? Or had he seen something I hadn't? I may never know, but his words remain etched in my memory, a reminder that sometimes even the smallest interactions can leave a lasting impact. Story 2. It was a chilly Friday evening when I decided to spend some time alone at home. After a hectic week of meetings, deadlines, and endless phone calls, the thought of curling up on the couch with a warm blanket and a good book sounded like the perfect remedy. The soft pitter-patter of rain on the windows added to the cozy atmosphere as I settled in, a steaming cup of tea resting on the side table beside me. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. I had always enjoyed the solitude, the peace that came with being alone. But as the minutes turned into hours, a strange feeling began to creep over me. At first it was subtle, a faint sensation that I was being watched. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my overactive imagination fueled by the eerie weather. The book I was reading was gripping, but every now and then, I found my attention drifting toward the window. The rain had intensified and the glass was streaked with droplets. The street outside was deserted, illuminated only by the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. I tried to shake the feeling, focusing on the words on the page, but the unease refused to fade. Then it happened. A soft, barely audible knock at the front door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Who could it be at this hour? It was nearly midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My mind raced through the possibilities. A neighbor? A lost traveler seeking directions? Or something more sinister? I placed the book down and stood up, my steps hesitant as I approached the door. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady despite the nervous flutter in my chest. No response. I reached for my phone, keeping it in hand as I peered through the peephole. The porch light illuminated the small area outside, but there was no one there. The doorstep was empty, the rain continuing to pour relentlessly. My stomach churned with unease as I double-checked the locks, ensuring everything was secure. Perhaps it was just a prank, I thought. Kids messing around, or maybe even the wind knocking something against the door. I returned to the couch, but the comfort I had felt earlier was gone. Every creak of the house felt amplified. Every shadow cast by the dim light seemed to dance with a sinister purpose. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. My eyes darted toward the window once more, and that's when I saw it. A figure, just barely visible through the rain-streaked glass, standing across the street, illuminated by the flickering street lamp. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make out the details. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to acknowledge my presence. They just stood there, facing my house. A chill ran down my spine. I turned off the lamp beside me, plunging the room into darkness, and moved to a different window for a better view. The figure was still there, motionless, shrouded in shadow. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? There's someone standing across the street and they're not doing anything? It sounded ridiculous even in my head. Still, the feeling of dread was impossible to ignore. The minutes stretched on, and the figure remained unmoving. Finally, summoning my courage, I flipped on the porch light and opened the front door just enough to call out, "Is someone there? Do you need help?" No response. The rain seemed louder now, a relentless drumming that drowned out the sound of my own breathing. I shut the door, locking it once more, and pulled the curtains closed. My heart was pounding, and every instinct screamed at me to stay alert. I barely slept that night, every sound magnified in the silence. When morning finally came, the figure was gone, and the street was empty. But the sense of unease lingered. I went through the day trying to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, my imagination running wild. Yet deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched, that someone had been there. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself drawn to the window once more. The street lamp flickered on, casting its dim glow over the wet pavement. My eyes scanned the street, searching for any sign of the figure. And then, I saw it. A piece of paper, folded neatly, sitting on my porch. I opened the door cautiously, glancing around before picking it up. The paper was damp from the rain but still legible. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were 3 words that sent a chill down my spine. I'm still here. My hands trembled as I clutched the note, my mind racing with questions. Who had left it? Why? And what did they want from me? The street was empty once more, the rain beginning to fall again as the night closed in. I locked the door and double-checked every window, my paranoia reaching new heights. That night I barely slept again, every creak and shadow keeping me on edge. The note sat on the kitchen counter, a haunting reminder that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they were watching, and I had no idea what they would do next. Story 3. It started like any ordinary evening. I was lounging in my living room, scrolling through my phone with the soft hum of the television in the background. The air outside was crisp, and the faint sound of leaves rustling added a calming touch to the ambiance. But that peace didn't last long. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The television shut off, the lights flickered out, and the familiar hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen ceased entirely. For a moment, I sat frozen, my phone's screen providing the only light in the room. A power outage wasn't uncommon, but something about this felt different. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and made my way to the breaker box in the basement. As I descended the stairs, the creak of each step echoed through the silent house. The beam of my phone cut through the darkness, revealing the cold cement walls of the basement. I reached the breaker box and flipped the switches, but nothing happened. Frustrated, I sighed and made my way back upstairs. When I returned to the living room, I noticed something odd. The front door, which I had locked earlier, was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. Had I forgotten to lock it? Or worse, had someone opened it? "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The only response was the faint rustle of leaves outside. I hesitated, then slowly approached the door. Pushing it open, I peered outside. The street was eerily quiet, bathed in the dim glow of the moon. No sign of movement, no unusual sounds. I closed the door, this time making sure to lock it securely. As I turned away, a noise from upstairs caught my attention. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps. My stomach churned. I was certain I was alone in the house. Adrenaline surged through me as I grabbed a nearby umbrella, the closest thing to a weapon within reach, and cautiously made my way up the stairs. Each step felt agonizingly slow. The creaks of the wooden stairs seemed louder than ever. When I reached the top, I paused, listening. The sound came again, this time from my bedroom. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, my phone's flashlight illuminating the room. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked the closet, under the bed, even the adjoining bathroom. Everything was as it should be. Relieved but still uneasy, I made my way back downstairs. As I reached the bottom step, I froze. The living room lights flickered back on, casting an unsettling glow over the space. For a moment, I felt a sense of relief. The power was back. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the coffee table lay a single sheet of paper. I was certain it hadn't been there before. Heart pounding, I approached it cautiously. Scrawled across the paper in uneven handwriting were the words, "You're not alone." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Who had written this? How had they gotten in? My mind raced as I checked the locks again. They were all secure. The windows were shut tight. There was no sign of forced entry. Grabbing my phone, I dialed the police. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to my panicked explanation. They assured me an officer would be dispatched immediately. Until then, I was told to stay put and lock myself in a room. I chose the bathroom, locking the door and sitting on the edge of the tub, my umbrella still in hand. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every sound making me jump. Finally, I heard a knock at the front door. "Police!" a voice called out. Relief washed over me as I unlocked the door and let them in. Two officers stepped inside, their presence reassuring. They searched the house thoroughly but found no signs of anyone else. The note on the coffee table was bagged as evidence, and they promised to keep an eye on the neighborhood. After they left, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whoever had been in my house was gone. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside kept me on edge. The next day, I decided to install security cameras around the house. The technician arrived in the afternoon and set up cameras covering every entry point. That night, I felt a little safer knowing I could monitor the house. But the unease didn't go away. 2 days later, while reviewing the footage, I noticed something that made my heart stop. At around 3 a.m., a shadowy figure appeared on the camera near the back door. They didn't try to enter but stood there for several minutes, staring at the house. Then, just as silently as they had appeared, they walked away. I called the police again, showing them the footage. They assured me they'd increase patrols in the area, but their words did little to ease my fear. Whoever this was, they weren't just trying to scare me. They were watching me. Weeks passed, and the visits stopped. I began to relax, convincing myself that whoever it was had moved on. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that somewhere out there, someone is still keeping tabs on me. And every time I see a shadow in the corner of my eye or hear a noise I can't explain, I'm reminded of that note. You're not alone. Story 4. It was late in the evening, and the small bookstore on the corner of Maple Street was preparing to close for the night. Emily, the young woman who managed the store, stood behind the counter, her fingers deftly sorting the receipts from the day. The bell above the door jingled softly, startling her. She looked up, expecting to see a last-minute customer, but instead a tall man wearing a black coat and hat stepped inside. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, and he carried a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. "We're about to close," Emily said politely, her voice tinged with curiosity. The man's presence felt unusual, given the time and the bookstore's quiet reputation. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he approached the counter with deliberate slowness, each step echoing faintly against the wooden floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly. "I'm looking for something specific," he said, setting the satchel on the counter. Emily's curiosity deepened, but she maintained her composure. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked. The man reached into the satchel and pulled out an old leather-bound book. The cover was worn, its title embossed in faded gold lettering. He placed it gently on the counter and slid it toward her. "Do you have anything that might match this?" he asked, his dark eyes meeting hers for the first time. Emily studied the book. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed and edges frayed. The title, The Chronicle of Shadows, sent a shiver down her spine, though she couldn't say why. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Let me check our inventory." Leaving the man at the counter, Emily walked toward the back of the store, where the older, less frequented sections were kept. The air grew colder as she moved further away from the front, and the shadows seemed to deepen. She scanned the shelves, her fingers brushing over the spines of books that hadn't been touched in years. As she searched, a strange sensation crept over her, as though she were being watched. She paused, glancing over her shoulder, but the aisle was empty. Shaking off the unease, she continued her search, finally locating a book that seemed to fit the description. It was similar in size and style, though its title read, Whispers of the Forgotten. Emily returned to the counter and placed the book next to the man's. "This is the closest match I could find," she said. The man examined it carefully, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he nodded. "This will do," he said, pulling out a crisp $50 bill and placing it on the counter. Emily rang up the purchase, her unease growing with each passing second. As she handed the book to the man, their fingers brushed briefly, and a jolt of cold shot through her hand. She pulled back instinctively, her heart racing. The man didn't seem to notice. He simply placed the book in his satchel, tipped his hat, and walked out of the store without another word. The bell jingled again as the door closed behind him, and Emily let out a shaky breath. She glanced down at the counter where the man had stood. To her surprise, the original book he had shown her, The Chronicle of Shadows, was still there. He had left it behind. Curiosity warred with apprehension as she picked up the book. Its cover felt unnaturally cool to the touch, and a faint, musty smell wafted from its pages. Flipping it open, she found that the text inside was written in an unfamiliar language, the characters twisting and curling in ways that seemed almost alive. On the first page there was an inscription in English, "To those who seek may you find." Emily's unease deepened, but she couldn't resist the urge to take the book home. She locked up the store, her thoughts consumed by the mysterious man and the book he had left behind. At home, she settled into her favorite armchair, the book resting on her lap. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. As she turned the pages, she found herself drawn into the strange, swirling text. Her eyes began to blur, and a sense of disorientation washed over her. The room seemed to fade, replaced by a dark, endless void. When she came to, she was no longer in her living room. She stood in a vast, shadowy expanse. The ground beneath her feet cold and unyielding. The book was still in her hands, its pages glowing faintly in the darkness. Around her, whispers filled the air, soft and indistinct, as though coming from a great distance. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, forming words that she could just barely understand. "The seeker has arrived," they said over and over, like a chant. Panic set in as she clutched the book tightly. "What is this place?" she demanded. But there was no answer, only the relentless whispers. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the man from the bookstore, his face now fully visible. His eyes glowed an eerie white, and his expression was one of solemnity. "You have opened the door," he said, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "And now you must step through." Emily shook her head, backing away. "I don't understand," she said. "What door? What is this place?" The man raised a hand, and the book in her hands began to glow brighter. The whispers grew deafening, and the ground beneath her began to tremble. "You sought the truth," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Now you must face it." Before Emily could respond, the ground gave way, and she was plunged into darkness. Her screams echoed in the void as the whispers surrounded her, their words now clear. "The seeker has arrived. The seeker will know." And then, silence. When Emily woke, she was back in her living room, the book lying closed on the floor beside her. The lamp flickered, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. Her heart raced as she stared at the book, now completely ordinary in appearance. But she knew better. Whatever had happened, it wasn't over, and the whispers still lingered, faint but unmistakable, at the edge of her hearing. Story 5. It was a rainy evening when I decided to visit the old bookstore at the edge of town. The weather had been unpredictable all day, with heavy clouds looming overhead, and now the rain came down in steady sheets. Armed with my umbrella and a sense of curiosity, I made my way down the dimly lit street, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the puddles forming beneath me. The bookstore was a relic of another time, its wooden sign creaking faintly in the wind. The large windows were fogged up, obscuring the view of the interior, but a faint warm glow seeped through the cracks, inviting me in. As I pushed the heavy door open, the familiar scent of aged paper and leather-bound books enveloped me like an old friend. The soft chime of a bell announced my arrival, but there was no immediate sign of the shopkeeper. "Hello," I called out, my voice absorbed by the shelves that stretched high toward the ceiling. Rows upon rows of books filled the space, creating a labyrinth of stories waiting to be discovered. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. As I wandered deeper into the store, I noticed a peculiar section tucked away in the back corner. A handwritten sign above it read, "Restricted Collection," in faded ink. The books here were different from the rest, their covers darker, their spines embossed with strange symbols. Something about them drew me closer, as if they held secrets not meant for the casual reader. One book in particular caught my eye. It was bound in black leather, with no title or markings on the cover except for a single intricate symbol etched in silver. Hesitating for a moment, I reached out and picked it up. The leather was cold to the touch, sending a slight shiver up my spine. As I opened the cover, the pages inside were yellowed and brittle, yet the writing was surprisingly legible, written in a language I couldn't recognize. A sudden noise made me jump. It sounded like something had fallen, or perhaps been knocked over. Turning quickly, I saw a figure standing at the end of the aisle. The man, presumably the shopkeeper, was older, with a thin frame and a face lined with years of experience. His eyes, however, were sharp and intense, locking onto the book in my hands. "You shouldn't be handling that," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "That's not a book for casual readers." Embarrassed, I quickly closed the book and returned it to the shelf. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to intrude." He stepped closer, his gaze softening slightly. "It's not your fault," he said, "but some knowledge comes with a price. That book has a history, one that's best left untouched." Curiosity burned within me, but I nodded politely and stepped away from the section. The shopkeeper seemed to watch me for a moment longer, before returning to his desk near the front of the store. I continued to browse, though my thoughts kept drifting back to the mysterious book. After purchasing a couple of novels from a less ominous section, I left the store and stepped back into the rainy night. The air felt colder now, and the streets seemed emptier than before. As I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. Shaking off the unease, I changed into dry clothes and settled onto the couch with one of the books I had bought. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying the events at the bookstore and the strange aura of that forbidden section. Later that night, as I was preparing for bed, I heard a faint sound coming from the living room. It was subtle at first, like the rustling of paper. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept toward the source of the noise. The living room was empty, but the sound persisted, growing louder as I approached my bookshelf. There, sitting on the shelf, was the black leather book from the restricted collection. I stared at it in disbelief, my mind racing to understand how it had gotten there. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch it, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage. But it was real, as cold and solid as it had felt in the store. Summoning my courage, I opened the book once more. This time the writing seemed to shift before my eyes, the unfamiliar symbols rearranging themselves into words I could understand. The pages told of ancient rituals and forbidden knowledge, of powers that could be summoned but never fully controlled. The more I read, the more I felt an invisible weight pressing down on me, as if the book itself was alive and aware of my presence. A sudden knock at the door startled me, breaking the spell the book had cast. My heart raced as I cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. No one was there. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty save for a single item lying on the floor. A small silver key, engraved with the same symbol that adorned the book's cover. Holding the key in my hand, I felt a strange sense of purpose, as if I had been chosen for something beyond my understanding. But along with that purpose came a creeping dread. What had I gotten myself into? And more importantly, what price would I have to pay for the knowledge I had uncovered? As the night wore on, the answers to those questions began to reveal themselves, and I realized that some doors are meant to remain locked. Story 6. It was a chilly Thursday evening, and I was driving back home after a long day at work. The air was crisp, and the roads were unusually deserted. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced in my peripheral vision. I turned up the heater in my car and tried to shake off the fatigue that was beginning to settle in. Little did I know, that night would be anything but ordinary. As I approached a curve near the edge of the woods, my car's headlights caught sight of something lying in the middle of the road. I slowed down, squinting to make out the shape. It was a suitcase, a large, old-fashioned one, with scuffed edges and worn leather straps. My immediate reaction was to swerve around it, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over to the side, turned on my hazard lights, and stepped out into the cold. The suitcase looked out of place, as if it had been deliberately left there. I hesitated for a moment, glancing around to see if anyone was nearby. The road was silent, and the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Taking a deep breath, I crouched down and inspected the suitcase. It wasn't locked, and the clasps were slightly loose. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside, I found a strange assortment of items. A stack of old photographs, a small diary with a cracked leather cover, and a bundle of letters tied together with a frayed ribbon. Everything smelled faintly of mothballs and age. The photographs were black and white, depicting a family, a man, a woman, and a young boy. Their faces seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen them before. The diary's pages were filled with neat handwriting, but I couldn't make sense of the entries in the dim light. Before I could delve any deeper, I heard a sound behind me, a low crunch of gravel. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, clutching the suitcase like a shield. A figure stood a few feet away, barely visible in the shadows. They were tall and cloaked in darkness, their face obscured by the hood of a heavy coat. "That doesn't belong to you," the person said, their voice low and steady. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the suitcase. I found it in the middle of the road. I was just... "Put it down," they interrupted, stepping closer. The tension in the air was palpable. I debated whether to run, but my legs felt like lead. The suitcase seemed to pulse with an unseen weight, as if it held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. Reluctantly, I placed the suitcase back on the ground and took a step back. The figure crouched down, their gloved hands carefully inspecting the contents. For a moment, they seemed to forget I was there, their focus entirely on the suitcase. Then they looked up, and I caught a glimpse of their eyes, sharp, piercing, and filled with something I couldn't quite decipher. "You should leave," they said, their tone more of a command than a suggestion. "Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I backed away slowly, then turned and hurried to my car. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, and it took me 3 tries to get the engine started. As I drove off, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was still there, standing motionless in the road, the suitcase at their feet. The rest of the drive home was a blur. My mind raced with questions. Who was that person? Why was the suitcase so important? And why had it been left in the middle of the road? None of it made sense, and the unease lingered long after I'd locked the doors and turned on every light in my house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to piece together the puzzle. Around 2 a.m., I decided to do something I'd been avoiding since I got home. I pulled out my phone and searched for news about the area where I'd found the suitcase. At first, nothing seemed relevant, but then a headline caught my eye. "Family vanishes near Woodside Road," the same road where I'd stopped. The article was dated 5 years ago and detailed the disappearance of a family of 3, a man, a woman, and their young son. The accompanying photo sent a chill down my spine. It was the same family from the photographs in the suitcase. I spent the rest of the night digging deeper into the story. Rumors of strange occurrences in the area, whispers of a cursed suitcase that appeared to those who were chosen, and accounts of people who had gone missing after encountering it. The more I read, the more I realized that I might have narrowly escaped something far darker than I'd initially thought. The next morning, I drove past Woodside Road on my way to work, unable to resist the urge to look. The suitcase was gone. So was any trace of the figure I'd encountered. The road looked as ordinary as ever, but I knew better. I knew that some things aren't meant to be explained. To this day, I can't drive down that road without feeling a knot in my stomach. The memory of that night lingers like a shadow, a reminder that the world is full of mysteries best left undisturbed. And sometimes the answers we seek are the very ones we should run from. Story 7. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the air felt unnervingly still, and the world seemed to hold its breath. I was on my way home after a long day, the streetlights casting faint glows that barely pierced through the thick fog enveloping the neighborhood. The usual hum of distant traffic seemed absent, leaving only the sound of my footsteps echoing on the damp pavement. The eerie silence wrapped itself around me, amplifying every small noise. A rustle of leaves, the faint creak of a swaying branch, and the soft crunch of gravel somewhere behind me. Initially, I ignored it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I turned a corner and the sound persisted, my pulse quickened. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing, just the dense fog stretching endlessly behind me. A chill crept up my spine, and I quickened my pace, clutching my bag tightly as I moved closer to the faint glow of my apartment building. Reaching the front door, I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling slightly. A sudden noise behind me, a sharp snap, like a twig breaking, made me whirl around. Again, there was nothing, just the fog and the empty street. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open and stepped inside, locking it firmly behind me. The familiar warmth of my apartment was a relief, but the unease lingered. I set my bag down and moved to the window, peering out through the curtains. The street outside was empty, the fog swirling like a living entity under the dim streetlights. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind overreacting to the stillness of the night. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been followed. As I settled onto the couch and turned on the television, the background noise provided some comfort, but my attention kept drifting back to the window. An hour passed, then two. The unease refused to fade. I decided to distract myself by sorting through some old boxes in the corner of the room. They had been sitting there since I moved in, untouched and gathering dust. As I sifted through photographs, old letters, and knickknacks, I came across a small, weathered notebook. It wasn't mine. The cover was a deep, faded blue and the edges were frayed. Curious, I opened it. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, though much of it was smudged and faded with time. The entries appeared to be journal-like, detailing strange events and cryptic observations. One entry caught my eye. November 12th. The fog is thicker tonight. I hear footsteps outside my window, but when I look, there's no one there. The feeling of being watched grows stronger. I've locked all the doors, but I'm not sure it will make a difference. My breath hitched as I read the words. The date was from years ago, but the description matched my own unsettling experience that evening. Flipping through more pages, I found similar entries, each one describing an increasing sense of dread, strange noises, and shadowy figures appearing in the fog. The final entry sent chills down my spine. December 3rd. They're here. I can hear them at the door. If someone finds this, please, don't let the fog in. I stared at the notebook, my hands trembling. Was this some kind of joke? A coincidence? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Just then, a soft knock echoed through the apartment. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, clutching the notebook tightly. The knock came again, louder this time. I crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but swirling fog. The knocking continued, steady and insistent. Summoning my courage, I called out, "Who's there?" No response. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The notebook's warning played over and over in my head. Don't let the fog in. The knocking grew more frantic, almost desperate, and then it stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. I stayed where I was, too afraid to move, until I heard something even more chilling, the sound of my living room window creaking open. Panic surged through me as I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and rushed toward the living room. The window was ajar, fog seeping in like ghostly tendrils, curling and twisting as if alive. My pulse raced as I slammed the window shut, locking it securely. The fog outside seemed to press against the glass, almost as if it were trying to get in. I backed away, clutching the lamp tightly, my eyes darting around the room. A faint whisper reached my ears, barely audible but unmistakable. It was coming from the notebook, still lying open on the coffee table. Trembling, I approached it, the whisper growing louder. The words on the page were changing, rearranging themselves before my eyes. You let it in. A surge of cold terror washed over me as the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, save for the pale glow of the fog now seeping through the cracks around the window and door. Shadows began to form within the fog, tall and distorted, their movements slow and deliberate. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The shadows moved closer, their forms becoming more defined. Eyes glinted in the darkness, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Desperate, I grabbed the notebook and hurled it across the room. The voices stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was silence. Then the fog receded, pulling back through the cracks as if retreating. The shadows faded and the lights flickered back on. I stood there trembling as the oppressive silence returned. The notebook lay on the floor, its pages blank. Whatever presence had been in my apartment was gone, but the unease lingered. I knew one thing for certain. The fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it was something else, something dangerous. And it wasn't finished with me. Story 8. It was a chilly autumn night, and the faint rustle of leaves danced in the wind as I made my way home. The air carried a dampness that hinted at an impending rain, and the streets were eerily empty. I had taken a shortcut through an old park, the kind of place that felt forgotten by time. The lampposts flickered weakly, casting uneven shadows that seemed to shift and stretch in ways that made my skin crawl. It was the kind of night that made you question whether you were truly alone. I adjusted my scarf and quickened my pace, eager to leave the unsettling atmosphere behind. As I approached the edge of the park, a sound stopped me in my tracks, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of that. The whisper came again, this time clearer, and it sounded like my name. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice betraying my unease. The silence that followed was deafening. Trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, I told myself it was just my imagination. But then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Ahead of me, under the dim light of a flickering lamppost, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. It hadn't been there moments ago. Slowly I approached it, my curiosity battling with my better judgment. The paper was damp, its edges frayed, and as I unfolded it, I saw a single sentence scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Don't go home." My pulse quickened. Was this some kind of sick joke? I glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows, but the park remained empty. The warning felt personal, deliberate. Despite the knot of fear tightening in my chest, I decided to keep moving. If this was someone's idea of a prank, I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The path led me out of the park and onto the quiet streets of my neighborhood. The houses were dark, their occupants presumably tucked away for the night. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, but there was no one there. Yet the sensation of unseen eyes following my every move grew stronger with each step. When I finally reached my house, I hesitated at the front door. The warning on the note replayed in my mind like a broken record. I shook my head, trying to dispel the irrational fear. My house was my sanctuary. Nothing bad could happen there. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping on the lights. The familiar surroundings brought a momentary sense of relief, but that relief was short-lived. As I set my bag down and removed my coat, I noticed something out of place. The living room window, which I always kept locked, was slightly ajar. A cold draft seeped through the gap, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of wet earth. My heart raced as I approached the window, peering out into the darkness. The street was empty, but the unease that had been building all evening now felt suffocating. I locked the window and drew the curtains, telling myself it must have been an oversight, but deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right. I decided to double-check the rest of the house, ensuring all the doors and windows were secure. As I moved from room to room, the sense of being watched intensified. In the kitchen, I found another piece of paper. It was sitting on the counter, as if placed there intentionally. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The message this time was even more chilling. "You're not alone." Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, but the line was filled with static. Frustrated, I tried again, only to hear the same garbled noise. It was as if someone didn't want me to call for help. I considered leaving the house, but the thought of stepping back into the night was equally terrifying. Instead, I armed myself with a kitchen knife and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. Minutes felt like hours as I sat on the edge of my bed. Every creak and groan of the house magnified in the silence. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone inside the house? Were they watching me right now? I thought about the note in the park and how it had all led to this moment. Suddenly, a noise outside my bedroom door snapped me out of my thoughts. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps. I held my breath, gripping the knife tightly. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. Then the doorknob rattled. A voice, low and distorted, spoke from the other side. "You should have listened." The blood drained from my face. Whoever this was, they had been watching me all along. Summoning every ounce of courage, I yelled, "I'm calling the police!" "Leave now." The voice on the other side chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "It's too late," it said. In a desperate bid for survival, I threw open the window and climbed out onto the roof, clutching the knife. The cold night air bit at my skin as I scrambled down the side of the house and onto the street. I ran without looking back, my only thought being to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. Eventually, I found myself at a gas station, its bright lights a welcome contrast to the darkness I had just escaped. The attendant gave me a concerned look as I stumbled inside, out of breath and visibly shaken. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words came out in a jumbled mess. He called the police for me, and I finally felt a shred of hope. When the officers arrived, they escorted me back to my house. The place was empty, with no sign of forced entry or anyone lurking inside. But on the living room table was another note. "You can't escape." To this day, I don't know who or what was behind that terrifying night. I moved away shortly after, leaving the house and its haunting memories behind. But no matter how far I go, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Story 9, it was a cold winter night, the kind that chills you to the bone. The streets were blanketed with freshly fallen snow, muffling the sounds of the world outside. I had just finished a late shift at work and was heading home, eager to escape the biting cold and sink into the warmth of my small apartment. The streets were eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of distant traffic breaking the silence. As I walked, I noticed the oddest thing. A man in a long, dark coat standing completely still under a streetlight. His figure cast a long shadow on the pristine snow. He didn't move, didn't seem to notice the freezing wind or the occasional car that passed by. Something about him made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I decided to keep my head down and walk past him quickly, but as I approached, I realized he wasn't alone. There were footprints in the snow leading to and from his position, yet no one else was in sight. My pulse quickened as I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe someone had just left? Maybe he was waiting for someone? When I was just a few steps away, the man suddenly turned his head to look at me. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but I could see his eyes, piercing and unblinking. "Be careful," he said, his voice low and gravelly. It was the same phrase I had heard in countless unsettling encounters over the years, but this time it felt different. This time, it felt like a warning I couldn't ignore. I nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond, and hurried past him. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me as I walked away. When I glanced back over my shoulder, he was gone. The streetlight he had been standing under flickered once and then went out, plunging that part of the street into darkness. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was thoroughly spooked. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and drew the curtains tight. But even in the safety of my home, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. His voice echoed in my mind. "Be careful." Be careful of what? I tried to distract myself with television, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the man under the streetlight. Why had he been there? Who was he warning me about? Or was he warning me about himself? The question swirled in my mind until I finally decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would bring some clarity or at least some peace. That night, my dreams were anything but peaceful. I dreamed of shadowy figures moving silently through the snow, their faces obscured and their intentions unclear. The streetlight from earlier appeared again and again, flickering ominously before plunging me into darkness. And always I heard his voice, "Be careful." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:33 a.m. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a dream, just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the window. I froze, every nerve in my body on high alert. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, my breath caught in my throat. The curtains were still drawn, but I could see a faint silhouette behind them, backlit by the streetlights outside. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I reached for the baseball bat I kept under my bed. My hands trembled as I gripped it tightly and approached the window. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a voice, low and familiar, came from the other side of the glass. "Be careful." I yanked the curtains open, bat raised, but there was no one there. The street outside was empty, the snow undisturbed except for my own footprints leading to the building. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there were no answers to be found. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. My phone would ring, but when I answered, there was only static on the other end. And every night I would hear that same tapping on the window, always at 3:33 a.m. I tried to confide in a friend, but they dismissed my concerns as paranoia brought on by stress and lack of sleep. Maybe they were right, I thought. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The man under the streetlight had warned me, and I had ignored his warning. One night, I decided to stay awake, determined to confront whatever or whoever was tormenting me. I sat in the dark with the baseball bat in hand, my eyes fixed on the window. When the clock struck 3:33 a.m., the tapping began just as it had every night before. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to get up and approach the window. This time I didn't bother calling out. I yanked the curtains open in one swift motion, ready to face whatever was on the other side. But again, there was nothing there. The street was empty, the snow untouched, and yet the tapping continued, louder and more insistent. It wasn't until I looked down that I saw them, the footprints in the snow, leading from the street to my window. They were fresh, but there was no one around to have made them. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was happening to me? Was I losing my grip on reality? In the days that followed, I became a prisoner in my own home, too afraid to go outside or even look out the window. The tapping continued every night, and the man's warning replayed in my mind like a broken record. "Be careful." One morning I woke up to find a note slipped under my door. The paper was old and yellowed, the handwriting spidery and uneven. It read, "You've been marked. Be careful." I don't know who left the note or what it meant, but I knew one thing for certain. My life would never be the same again. Story 10. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound filling the otherwise silent room. Sarah sat at her desk, the soft glow of her laptop screen illuminating her face. The deadline for her project loomed, and she was determined to finish it tonight. Outside, the world was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves carried by the wind. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel both safe and uneasy at the same time. As she typed, Sarah felt a strange sensation, a prickling at the back of her neck. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, and glanced around. The room was empty, the shadows in their usual places, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shaking her head, she dismissed the thought as paranoia from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. The night wore on, and Sarah's focus wavered. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms above her head when she heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible. It was like a whisper, carried through the still air. She froze, her heart pounding. Straining her ears, she listened intently, but the sound didn't come again. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, returning her attention to the screen. But the sense of unease had settled in her chest, and she found it hard to concentrate. Just as she began to type again, her laptop screen flickered. The bright, familiar interface was replaced by static for a split second before returning to normal. Sarah frowned, her fingers pausing on the keyboard. "That's weird," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her Wi-Fi signal was strong, and her laptop had never given her any trouble before. She checked her connection, finding everything intact. Dismissing it as a glitch, she tried to refocus on her work. But then it happened again. This time the static lingered a little longer before fading away. Sarah's heart began to race. She closed her laptop and stood up, her eyes scanning the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, as though they were alive. The air felt heavier. the silence more oppressive. She grabbed her phone from the desk, intending to call a friend or perhaps just distract herself, but the screen was dead. No matter how many times she pressed the power button, it refused to turn on. A sudden creak broke the silence, making Sarah jump. The sound had come from the hallway outside her room. Her breathing quickened as she stared at the closed door, her mind racing with possibilities. She reached for the desk lamp, gripping it like a weapon as she moved cautiously toward the door. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitant to open it. Finally summoning her courage, she twisted the knob and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by a single overhead light. The floorboards creaked softly under her feet as she stepped out, her eyes darting around. The sound came again, this time louder and closer. It was a scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. Sarah's grip on the lamp tightened as she followed the noise, her steps slow and deliberate. The sound led her to the living room, where the faint glow of the streetlight outside cast eerie shadows on the walls. In the center of the room, the coffee table had been moved. It was out of place, angled oddly as if someone had pushed it in a hurry. Sarah's pulse quickened as she realized she hadn't moved it herself. The sound came again, this time from the kitchen. It was unmistakable now. Footsteps. Someone was in her house. Panicking, Sarah backed away from the living room, her eyes never leaving the darkened kitchen doorway. She debated her options. Should she confront the intruder or make a run for it? Her phone was useless, and the nearest neighbor was too far to hear her screams. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and cloaked in darkness, its features obscured. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step toward her. "Who are you? What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. Without thinking, Sarah swung the lamp in her hand, aiming for the figure. But it moved with unnatural speed, dodging her attack effortlessly. The lamp slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor and plunging the room into darkness. Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding as she groped blindly for something, anything, to defend herself. A cold hand closed around her wrist, its grip like iron. Sarah screamed, struggling against the hold, but it was no use. The figure's strength was inhuman. Just as she felt herself being pulled closer, a blinding light flooded the room. The figure released her, retreating into the shadows with an unearthly hiss. Sarah turned toward the source of the light, her eyes adjusting to see a man standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a security uniform, a flashlight in his hand. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. Sarah nodded, her legs trembling as she leaned against the wall for support. There's someone in the house," she stammered. The security guard scanned the room with his flashlight, but the figure was gone. "I didn't see anyone when I came in," he said, his brow furrowed. "Let me check the rest of the house." Sarah waited in the living room, her heart still racing as the guard searched every room. He returned a few minutes later, shaking his head. "Whoever it was, they're gone now. You should call the police and report this." She nodded, her mind still reeling. After the guard left, Sarah locked all the doors and windows, double-checking them before finally collapsing onto the couch. Sleep was out of the question. All she could do was sit there, clutching a kitchen knife, and wait for the dawn. The next morning, Sarah found a single object on the coffee table that hadn't been there before. A small black feather. She stared at it, her mind racing with questions. Who or what had been in her house? And what did they want? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain: her life would never feel the same again. Story 11. It started as just another evening in the city. The hum of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, and the glow of neon signs painted the streets in a familiar, chaotic rhythm. I had just left my office, the weight of a long day pressing on my shoulders, and decided to take a different route home. A small detour through a quiet alleyway seemed like a shortcut and a way to escape the noise. The alley was narrow, lined with old brick buildings that seemed to lean inwards, trapping the faint light from a flickering street lamp. The air felt cooler here, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something else I couldn't quite place. Halfway down the alley, I noticed a figure standing at the far end, motionless and partially obscured by shadows. I hesitated, instinctively clutching my bag tighter. The figure didn't move, didn't turn, just stood there, as if waiting. I told myself not to be ridiculous. It was probably just someone on a smoke break or checking their phone. Mustering my courage, I continued walking. As I got closer, the figure stepped into the light. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and piercing eyes that seemed to catch every flicker of the weak light. He was dressed in a long, dark coat, his hands buried deep in his pockets. When our eyes met, he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Be careful," he said, his voice low and smooth, with an edge that hinted at menace. He turned and walked away before I could respond, his footsteps echoing faintly against the walls. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to follow or flee. Something about his words felt less like a warning and more like a promise. Shaking off the unease, I hurried out of the alley and back onto the busy street, but the feeling stayed with me. As I walked, I felt the weight of eyes on my back, though every time I turned, there was nothing but the ordinary bustle of city life. By the time I reached my apartment, my nerves were frayed. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it before tossing my bag onto the couch. The lights flickered as I turned them on, casting strange shadows across the room. I blamed my growing paranoia and tried to settle into my usual evening routine. Hours passed, but the unease never left. Every creak of the building, every distant sound from the street below, seemed magnified. I decided to distract myself with a book, curling up on the couch under a warm blanket. It was almost midnight when I heard it, a soft tapping at my window. My apartment was on the 4th floor. There shouldn't be anyone outside my window. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. My heart raced as I set the book down and approached the window cautiously. The curtains were drawn, and for a moment, I debated whether to pull them aside. Summoning my courage, I yanked the curtains open. There was nothing there, just the empty fire escape and the faint glow of city lights beyond. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself it had been the wind or maybe a stray bird. But as I turned away, a sound stopped me in my tracks, a low, guttural whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. "Be careful," it said. My blood turned cold. I spun around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. My own reflection stared back at me from the darkened window, wide-eyed and pale. The rest of the night was a blur. I barely slept, jumping at every sound and checking the locks multiple times. When morning finally came, I felt a small sense of relief, the sunlight chasing away the night's terrors. But the man's words and the events that followed lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. I noticed the same tall man from the alley in unexpected places, on the opposite platform at the subway station, across the street from my office, even outside my favorite cafe. He never approached me, but his presence was impossible to ignore. His piercing gaze seemed to follow me wherever I went, his slow smile a constant reminder of his cryptic warning. I started to feel like I was being watched, even when I was alone. The unease grew into full-blown paranoia. I avoided dark alleys, changed my routes, and even considered staying with a friend for a while. But no matter what I did, the feeling persisted. And then the notes started appearing. The first one was slipped under my apartment door, a small piece of paper with just 2 words scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. "Be careful." I stared at it for a long time, my hands trembling. Who had left it? How had they gotten into the building? I reported it to the building manager, who promised to check the security footage, but nothing came of it. The second note appeared inside my office, left on my desk during my lunch break. This time, it included a time and location. Tonight, 8 p.m., Pier 14. Against my better judgment, I decided to go. Curiosity and fear battled within me, but I needed answers. The pier was deserted when I arrived, the cold wind biting through my coat. The water lapped softly against the wooden beams, and the faint smell of salt filled the air. I waited, every nerve on edge. Finally, I saw him. The man from the alley stepped out of the shadows, his dark coat billowing in the wind. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaky but firm. He didn't answer immediately. his piercing eyes studying me with an intensity that made me feel exposed. "You needed to know," he said finally. "You're in danger." Before I could ask what he meant, a sudden noise drew our attention. Footsteps, quick and heavy, approached from behind me. I turned to see a group of men emerging from the darkness, their faces obscured. The man in the coat stepped forward, shielding me. "Run!" he commanded, his voice sharp and urgent. Without thinking, I obeyed, sprinting down the pier as the sound of a scuffle erupted behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my lungs burning and my heart pounding. When I finally turned back, the pier was empty, the man and his attackers gone. I never saw him again. The notes stopped, and the feeling of being watched gradually faded. But his warning stayed with me, a haunting reminder of a night that changed everything. I don't know who he was or what danger he saved me from, but one thing is certain. I'll never forget the man in the alley and his chilling words. Be careful. Story 12. It started with a noise. Not an obvious one like a loud bang or a creak, but a faint, almost imperceptible humming sound that filled the air of my otherwise silent apartment. I noticed it one Friday night as I sat on my couch, scrolling through my phone. The sound was barely audible, like a distant vibration, but it was persistent enough to make me glance around. My first thought was that it was the fridge or some appliance, so I shrugged it off and continued scrolling. But then, it didn't stop. The hum grew louder as the night wore on, but not in a natural way. It felt as if it was creeping closer, enveloping the space around me. I got up, pacing the living room and checking every corner for the source. The fridge, the air conditioner, office, the pipes, silent. My frustration built as I systematically ruled out everything in my apartment. Finally, I decided it must be coming from outside. I opened the window and leaned out, scanning the quiet street below. It was late, close to midnight, and the usual city sounds had quieted to a distant murmur. Yet the hum persisted. I could feel it now, almost vibrating in my chest. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. Closing the window didn't help. In fact, it seemed to amplify the sensation, like the hum was bouncing off the walls, trapping me in its rhythm. I turned on the TV, hoping the noise would drown it out, but the sound, or whatever it was, just seemed to weave itself into the background. It was maddening. I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. Grabbing my keys and jacket, I stepped out into the hallway. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural in a building with multiple tenants. No TV sounds, no footsteps, nothing. Just the hum, faint but undeniable. I took the stairs down to the street, my ears straining for any sign that someone else might hear it. But no one was around. The streetlights flickered slightly, casting long, wavering shadows. Even though I was outside, the humming felt just as close, just as oppressive. I decided to walk to clear my head. The city felt surreal at this hour. The few people I passed didn't seem to notice anything unusual. A couple walked hand in hand, laughing softly. A man jogged by with headphones in. Everyone was going about their lives, oblivious to the hum that was now consuming my every thought. I turned down a side street, hoping the quiet might help me pinpoint the source. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the alley, a figure barely illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something. I hesitated, unsure if I should approach. "Do you hear it?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the stillness. It startled me, not just because she spoke, but because her tone was so matter-of-fact, as if she already knew the answer. "The humming?" I replied, my voice shaky. She nodded, her face still obscured in shadow. "It's been following me for days." A chill ran down my spine. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's getting louder." Before I could respond, she turned and started walking away. Instinctively, I followed her. Something about her demeanor told me she knew more than she was letting on. As we walked, the humming seemed to intensify, vibrating in the very air around us. It was as if the city itself was alive with the sound. She led me to an old building on the outskirts of the neighborhood, its facade cracked and weathered. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. This is where it's strongest, she said, motioning for me to follow. Inside, the hum was deafening. It was no longer just a sound, it was a force pressing against me from all sides. The walls seemed to pulse with it, the vibrations so intense that I felt them in my teeth. The woman walked ahead, unbothered by the overwhelming sensation. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know exactly," she said, stopping in the middle of the room. "But it's been here for as long as I can remember. People don't talk about it, but if you've heard the hum, you're already connected to it." Her words sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "Connected? Once you've noticed it, it notices you," she said cryptically. Before I could press her for more answers, the humming shifted. It became a low, resonant tone that seemed to resonate deep within my chest. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw shadows moving along the walls, independent of any visible source. "We need to go," she said suddenly, grabbing my arm. Her urgency snapped me out of my trance, and I followed her back toward the door. As we stepped outside, the hum abruptly stopped. The silence was so jarring that it felt almost as oppressive as the sound had been. "What just happened?" I asked, my voice shaky. She shook her head. "I don't know, but it's not over. Once it finds you, it doesn't let go." Her words haunted me as I walked home that night. The humming was gone, but the memory of it lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on me. Even now, as I sit in my apartment writing this, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it again, faint and distant, and every time I wonder if it's getting closer. Story 13. It started on a chilly autumn evening. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in a deep indigo hue. I was driving down a rural highway, flanked by dense forests on both sides. The road was eerily quiet, with not another car in sight. It was the kind of solitude that should have felt peaceful, but instead left me on edge. I had just attended a family gathering in a small town about 2 hours away from my home. The event had gone on later than expected, and by the time I started my journey back, it was already past 10 p.m. The stretch of highway I was on was notorious for its lack of cell service, so I'd made sure my car was in good condition and my tank was full before setting off. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. About 30 minutes into the drive, my headlights caught something up ahead. At first, it looked like an animal darting across the road, but as I drew closer, I realized it was a person, a woman. She stood on the shoulder of the highway, waving her arms frantically. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and her face was pale with what looked like desperation etched into her features. Instinctively, I slowed down. My first thought was that she might be in trouble, perhaps stranded or injured, but a small voice in the back of my mind urged caution. There had been stories, rumors really, about people faking emergencies to lure unsuspecting drivers into traps. I stopped the car a few feet away from her and rolled down the window just enough to speak. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice steady but cautious. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide and glistening with tears. "Please, you have to help me," she said, her voice trembling. "He's coming." My stomach tightened. "Who's coming?" She glanced over her shoulder, her movements quick and jittery, as if she expected someone to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "I don't have time to explain. Just drive. Please let me in." Every instinct screamed at me to keep my distance. Something about her urgency felt genuine, but there was an unpredictability in her demeanor that put me on edge. "Where do you need to go?" I asked, trying to buy myself some time to think. She shook her head violently. "Anywhere but here." Before I could respond, a sound echoed from the woods, a low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The woman's eyes widened in terror. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. She yanked it open and climbed in, slamming it shut behind her. "Go, drive." I pressed the accelerator, and the car lurched forward. As we sped down the highway, I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. She was shaking, her hands gripping the edge of her seat so tightly her knuckles were white. "Who are you running from?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Finally, she whispered, "It's not a person." My grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What do you mean?" She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. "It's something else, something that shouldn't exist." I didn't know what to say. My rational mind wanted to dismiss her words as the ramblings of someone in shock, but the primal part of me couldn't ignore the sincerity in her voice. Before I could press her further, the car's headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed, and the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," I muttered, gripping the wheel tightly as I tried to keep the car steady. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The car coasted to a stop, the engine completely dead. We were stranded in the middle of the highway, surrounded by darkness. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, only to remember that there was no signal out here. "What's going on?" I demanded, turning to her. She didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the rearview mirror, her face pale and bloodless. Slowly, I followed her line of sight. At first, I saw nothing. Then a shadow emerged from the tree line, tall and unnaturally thin. Its movements were jerky, almost insect-like, as it crept closer to the car. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't see us if we don't move." Every muscle in my body tensed as I watched the figure approach. Its shape became clearer with each step, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It had elongated limbs that ended in sharp, claw-like appendages, and its face, if you could call it that, was a featureless void. The creature stopped a few feet from the car, its head tilting as if sniffing the air. My pulse thundered in my ears and I held my breath, afraid that even the smallest sound would draw its attention. Minutes felt like hours as the creature circled the car, its claws scraping lightly against the metal. The woman beside me was shaking so hard I thought she might pass out. Finally, the creature let out a low, guttural growl and retreated back into the woods, its movements as unnatural as before. I didn't dare move until the forest was completely silent again. When I finally turned to the woman, she was staring straight ahead, her eyes filled with tears. "You should have left me," she whispered. "Now it knows about you too." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out into the darkness. "Wait!" I called after her, but she was already gone, disappearing into the shadows as if she'd never been there. The car started without issue when I turned the key, and I drove home as fast as I could. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in the safety of my own house. And sometimes, late at night, I hear faint scratching at my windows. Story 14. It all started with an envelope. It arrived on a breezy Friday morning, tucked neatly among the usual stack of bills and advertisements in my mailbox. What caught my eye was the lack of a return address and the elegant handwriting on the front, spelling out my name. Curious, I took it inside, set my coffee mug on the counter, and carefully tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. The message was brief, typed in a clean, serif font. "You're being watched. Be cautious." My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it might be some kind of prank, but as I scanned the paper for any clues, a logo, a signature, anything, I found nothing. The envelope and its contents were completely anonymous. I tried to brush it off as a hoax. Maybe someone was playing a joke, or it was part of some bizarre marketing stunt. But as the day went on, the words lingered in my mind. Who would send such a thing, and why? By the time the sun began to set, I had convinced myself to forget about it. But when I stepped outside to take my trash to the curb, I noticed something unusual. A car parked across the street, its windows tinted so dark that I couldn't see inside. It hadn't been there earlier in the day. I glanced around the quiet neighborhood, but there was no one else in sight. As I returned inside, a faint unease settled over me. Was I being paranoid? Or was there something more to that strange note than I wanted to believe? The next few days passed uneventfully. I went about my usual routine, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had taken root in my mind. But then on Tuesday evening, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a soft thud from outside. It was faint, like the sound of something light hitting the ground. I walked to the window and peeked through the curtains. At first, I saw nothing. Then my eyes landed on a small black object sitting on my porch. Cautiously, I opened the door and stepped outside. It was a package wrapped in plain brown paper with no labels or markings. My name was scrawled on the top in the same elegant handwriting as the envelope. I brought it inside and placed it on the table, staring at it as if it might spring to life. After a moment, I grabbed a knife and carefully cut through the tape. Inside was a small, old-fashioned key and a folded piece of paper. The message read, "Find the lock. Time is running out." I felt a chill run down my spine. What was this? A puzzle? A game? And if so, what was at stake? For the next several hours, I scoured every inch of my house, searching for any lock that might fit the key. I checked old cabinets, drawers, even a dusty trunk in the attic. Nothing. Exhausted and frustrated, I finally gave up and went to bed, the key and note sitting on my nightstand like unwelcome guests. That night, I dreamed of shadows. Dark figures moved through my house, their footsteps soft but deliberate. They whispered in voices I couldn't understand, and just as one of them reached out toward me, I woke up with a start. The room was pitch black, and for a moment I thought I heard something. A faint creak like the sound of a floorboard shifting under weight. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but the noise didn't come again. I told myself it was just the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to take the key to a locksmith. Maybe they could tell me more about it. The shop owner, an elderly man with a sharp eye, examined it closely. "This is a very old key," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Probably from the early 1900s. Looks like it would fit a padlock or maybe a small chest." "Can you tell where it might have come from?" I asked. He shook his head. "Afraid not, but whatever it opens, it's not something you'd find in a hardware store." I thanked him and left, feeling no closer to an answer. As I walked back to my car, I noticed the same dark sedan parked a few spaces away. My stomach twisted. Was someone following me? That night, I decided to take a different approach. I posted a picture of the key in the notes online, asking if anyone recognized them. The responses were varied. Some thought it was part of an escape room or a geocaching game, while others suggested it might be connected to a secret society or an urban legend. Then I received a private message. It was from an account with no profile picture and a username made up of random numbers and letters. The message read, "Stop looking. You're in danger." My blood ran cold. Who was this, and how did they find me? Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. I started receiving anonymous phone calls. Each time, the line was silent except for faint breathing. The car outside my house became a constant presence, and I was certain I saw someone watching me from the driver's seat. One evening, as I sat in my living room trying to make sense of it all, the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight. That's when I heard it, a slow, deliberate knock at the front door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time. Summoning all my courage, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. But there was no one there. When I finally opened the door, I found another note on the ground, weighed down by a small stone. It read, "You're running out of time." I don't know who's behind this or what they want, but one thing is clear. This is no prank. Whoever they are, they're watching me, and they're not going to stop. The question is, what happens when time runs out? Now settle in, because it's time for Story 15. It began with a small note left on my doorstep. At first glance, it seemed harmless, even a little charming. A folded piece of paper with my name written on it in neat, blocky handwriting. I picked it up, smiled at the mystery of it all, and unfolded it to read the message inside. "You forgot something." There was no signature, no clue as to who had written it. I frowned, racking my brain to think of what I might have forgotten. A package delivery? A meeting with someone? Nothing came to mind. I tucked the note into my pocket and went about my day, brushing it off as a harmless prank or perhaps a mistake. But the next day, another note appeared. This one was taped to my car's windshield. The same handwriting greeted me, crisp and deliberate. "You're not paying attention." A prickle of unease crawled up my spine. Someone was clearly going out of their way to communicate with me. But who? And what did they mean? I glanced around the street, hoping to catch sight of someone watching me, but everything seemed normal. Neighbors walked their dogs, kids rode their bikes, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement. I couldn't shake the feeling that those shadows were hiding something, or someone. By the third day, the notes had escalated. I found one slipped under my front door, resting just inside the entryway. This time the message was chillingly direct. "You're in danger." My hands trembled as I read it. Who was sending these notes? And why? I spent hours trying to piece it together, thinking of anyone who might have a reason to warn me or frighten me. Old friends, former co-workers, even distant acquaintances. No one came to mind. Yet the messages kept coming. By the fourth day, I had installed a security camera outside my house. I needed answers, and I was determined to find them. That night, I stayed up late, watching the live feed on my phone. The street outside was quiet, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights. Midnight came and went without incident, and I began to think that whoever was behind the notes had given up. And then, at 2:17 a.m., I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with deliberate care. They were dressed in all black, a hood pulled up to obscure their face. My heart raced as I watched them approach my front door. They crouched down, slipped a piece of paper through the gap, and then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, they were gone. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn broke, I retrieved the latest note, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. The words inside made my blood run cold. "Tonight is the night." I called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. No threats had been made, they said, and the figure on my security footage was unrecognizable. They advised me to stay vigilant and keep my doors locked. That was it. No patrols, no increased surveillance, just a generic warning to be careful. I didn't feel safe. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I double-checked every lock in my house. I closed the curtains, turned on all the lights, and kept a baseball bat within arm's reach. Despite my preparations, fear gnawed at me. What did the note mean? What was going to happen tonight? The hours dragged on. Midnight passed, and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift and move, taking on sinister shapes. And then, at exactly 3 a.m., the power went out. My house was plunged into darkness. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I grabbed the baseball bat and my phone, using its flashlight to navigate the pitch-black rooms. My heart pounded as I checked every window and door, searching for signs of an intruder. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from the basement. I froze, my grip on the bat tightening. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. Someone was down there. Summoning every ounce of courage, I made my way to the basement door. The flashlight beam shook as I shined it into the darkness below. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No response, just the sound of something moving. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder with each step, and the sense of dread was almost suffocating. At the bottom, I swept the flashlight around the room, searching for the source of the noise. And then I saw it. Another note taped to the wall. The message was chillingly simple. "You shouldn't have come down here." Before I could react, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, plunging me into total darkness. Panic set in as I raced back up the steps, pounding on the door and shouting for help. But no one answered. I was trapped. Hours passed. I don't know how long I sat there in the darkness, clutching the bat and waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the tiny basement window, I found the courage to force the door open. It wasn't locked, just stuck. The house was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. I moved out that same week. To this day, I don't know who was behind the notes or what their intentions were. All I know is that they wanted me to feel fear, and they succeeded. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that final note and the warning it carried. I shouldn't have gone down there, but curiosity got the better of me, and I paid the price. Thank you for listening to this Stories on Trail of Secret. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what you think. And as always, stay safe out there. You never know who might be watching.